we're going to take a look at this amazing article about 10 ways that The Lord of the Rings has aged so poorly. So few people like it these days because it's not hewing toward what modern Western civilization says The Lord of the Rings should be. This is an article that came up on cbr.com. Does that stand for something? I don't even know. I don't even think I want to know. However, we're going to go through all 10 reasons here.
I think it's Comic Book Review.
Comic Book Review. All right. Not a site I necessarily frequent very often. However, so what they're telling us here is that The Lord of the Rings hasn't entirely stood the test of time. For what they're getting that evidence from, I don't know, because it's always at the top of best-selling books, and all the books that come out hit the bestsellers that are referencing The Lord of the Rings. But even though Tolkien is largely responsible for modern fantasy, like many books that came out in the 50s, elements of Tolkien's work haven't aged particularly well. So, and though they're saying they're not bad things, they're just not good enough, and good enough can get you canceled enough these days. So let's go through these 10 reasons. And I love this, right? They say they're problematic and offensive, which to me is now Dan working at the Babylon Bee. Oh, this is a phrase that I think almost goes in most satire articles these days. It's just problematic.
Those are the words that you use when you don't actually have facts or logic on your side. It's like, this is problematic. It's because it offends me. Like, it's right. You know.
And I love it. It's uncorrected. We didn't put them into the correction chamber, into the classroom that would tell them, no, you're not correct. Here's the correct way to write The Lord of the Rings now.
Yeah.
All right. So let's get through this. Here is number 10 of all the ways The Lord of the Rings doesn't hold up anymore. Number 10, Tolkien's writers feature... let me start over there. Tolkien's writing features plot cul-de-sacs for the sake of world building. I think this author was really proud that they used the word cul-de-sac with plot in there. But I don't even know what this means. Here's what they write. Right. Tolkien's Middle-earth is one of the most... First of all, Middle-earth is always Middle-Earth, so no problem there. Is one of the most meticulously crafted fantasy settings in existence. Apart from Lord of the Rings, he details the history of Middle-earth in the Silmarillion and had tons of personal notes on the world. While this makes for an incredibly rich setting, it occasionally resulted in clunky storytelling. If there's one thing that I thought about the Silmarillion when I read it, it's clunky. It's not. When the main four hobbits take an unplanned detour through the old forest and meet the strange Tom Bombadil, readers are treated to many pages about a character who will soon disappear from the plot. While this establishes more about the world of Middle-earth, the famous modern audiences, are used to very streamlined stories and expect every chapter of a book to advance the main plot, kind of like, I don't know, the Da Vinci Code, right? Everything happens on every page, and it doesn't ever go anywhere. But it's streamlined.
I have a
feeling. All right, hot takes from each of us. That was Jonathan's. Go.
I was going to say, I have a feeling this is going to be a common thread through all these points, that modern audiences don't expect X, so therefore X is bad. It's like rather than thinking maybe there's a problem with us, maybe there's a problem with modern audiences.
Yep, you hit the nail on the head, Dan. The presumption of this whole article is that if something doesn't age well, the basis as we go through each of these points will be almost always, not always, but almost always, each of these 10 talks about how modern audiences expect something different. And the very fact that they expect something different is somehow implied to be wrong. Now, there are sometimes other reasons given as well, but that's the most common. That's the most common one, and that is puerile. It's infantile.
But clunky. Clunky is the word that this person uses, as if it's not even expertly done. Like, would they go back and read the Brothers Karamazov or Moby Dick and say, "Oh, it was clunky because it took too long, and he talked too much about whaling, and there was too much discourse in the Brothers Karamazov." Right?
They would, in fact.
They would. It's just that it also speaks to the complete ineptitude of this person as an actual reader of good things.
Right, and my hot take is it's your problem, Mr. Critic, is in the title. Tolkien's writing features plot cul-de-sacs for the sake of world building. It's world building. It's what made Tolkien's work great. So the fact that there's cul-de-sacs, that's what happens in world building, and that's what makes it so rich, as he himself admits. So that's the problem with number 10.
Yes, and not clunky.
Yeah, with this point just alone. I'm trying to find the words as to say this, but like, there's no objective standard here of that he's critiquing Tolkien on. It's purely subjective, and so even if someone were to write a book now that would fulfill this point of getting rid of all cul-de-sacs for the sake of world building, then what happens in 50 years when the standard changes again, and then the new postmodern audiences don't like what you just did? You know, if it's always subject to change, you can't really ever attain it.
Well, and for them, Dan, that's what the good is. The good is always having something new, always being able to trash the past and say, therefore, we need to have new stories. There can't be anything of enduring or objective good. So of course they're going to do this.
So number 9. Now that we've moved through plot cul-de-sacs, I think it's time to move into random characters show up for a short amount of time. So now the problem isn't that things are too long and clunky. Now they're too short. So it's the Goldilocks approach to writing. You've got to have it just right. This is what he writes. The Silmarillion and some of Tolkien's other writings, which were compiled in the histories of Middle-earth, Middle-earth again, cover a lot of the world's history. Some characters from these writings, notably the elf Glorfindel, make small appearances in Lord of the Rings, but don't influence the plot too much before leaving. Tolkien fans love these cameos, but modern readers are left frustrated by them. Do you remember all your friends who are frustrated by the cameo of Glorfindel or oh my gosh. Readers of contemporary fantasy like A Song of Ice and Fire are used to characters sticking around and making surprising contributions to the overall plot, though this element of Tolkien's writing may have aged poorly in novel form. Having cameos from random characters does seem to be taking off in the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
This is my favorite one of the 10 because he literally destroys his own argument within, like even by his own principles, which I reject, by the way. His principles being that the modern audience's expectations are what books need to adhere to in order to be considered good or having aged well. But I reject that. But he destroys it himself because there's a whole series of modern movies that uses exactly that plot point, which is the cameo. Also, I would say my other reaction is he does not understand apparently mystery and the idea of wonder. One of the things that I've noticed with every single one of my great number of children that I've read the Lord of the Rings to, is that when we get to the part with Glorfindel, and Glorfindel doesn't show up anymore, he just has this cameo, a couple cameos if you count the Council of Elrond, then you have a situation where this sparks their imagination. Of course, you might say, well, they would love to see more of Glorfindel. Okay, maybe they would, but there are plenty of other characters for them to ooh and ah over. And Glorfindel has this nature for them, which is they sit and they wonder about him. The small amount of information that we get, his power, the light and the fire. It's something that's fantastic to them. And those of them that read the Silmarillion, then you learn to love him even more. So this is not a weakness. This is actually a strength because,
in fact, this is not a weakness because it's in modern storytales too. If you look at Star Wars, there are tons of minor characters that have a backstory that are not revealed. Even when you go to 77, the original Star Wars, Biggs had a larger backstory. They actually just cut him out and were like, well, everyone's like, who's Biggs? Who's this guy? Who's Wedge? Why is he like all these characters that you don't really have a backstory to, though there was one. It makes it more interesting. It's a completely invalid point.
It actually draws their attention in. So it's the opposite of what they're saying here.
Yeah.
All right, brings us to number 8. Tolkien's heroes seem invincible. The Lord of the Rings largely centers on a war. Oh, okay. And they are written by a war veteran. Oh, okay. Considering these facts, it's strange that none of the main characters die. Can you believe it? Oh, wait, except for fans of the film that adaptation might argue Boromir.
Is that as stupid?
I'm like, what? Boromir dies. He's like a major character in the last half of the Fellowship of the Ring, and he dies doing what he should do, and he dies like he's as a complex character who realizes the error of his ways. Let me finish reading this. Of course, a character doesn't have to die to be affected by war. Tolkien himself knew that very well. However, modern audiences. Ding, ding, ding. Take a swig every time you hear that. Have the perception that characters dying and other dark elements make a work of fiction more, quote, realistic. Characters dying. Some readers may feel that a story where all the main heroes survive is outdated based on what they've come to expect from newer books. Everyone hates it when the good guys win.
Go ahead.
I find this whether a character survives or not is not a valid criticism of the quality of the storytelling. It simply is what it is. And there are characters that die and there are characters that survive. Gollum dies. I mean, you could say that he's a tortured character that ends up like, it's not like you're happy when he dies at the end of it, but Boromir dies. And to say that death simply makes it more realistic is a false analogy to, or is a false comparison to what would make an actual story good. Like, it doesn't matter, is my opinion on this. What were you going to say, Dan?
Well, it seems like to me, like having a casualty rating, 1 out of 9 of your characters die after the quest starts. That's pretty significant. And also that, you know, when the other characters come back home, like Frodo is like traumatized and has PTSD basically. So
yeah,
it's not like there's not consequences for these characters. They're not invincible. Like nothing matters or nothing bothers them. Or
right. I like that they also don't bring up that Thorin dies at the end of The Hobbit.
Mm-hmm. And Killian Philly.
And Killian Philly, right. Yeah, Michael, do you have any thoughts about this?
Invincible does not mean what they think it means. The entire backdrop of Tolkien's story is about how the heroes are not invincible. In fact, they're on the losing end. They cannot possibly hope to win in all the wars that they engage in. That's made very clear. And they're fighting a hopeless battle. They just have this one avenue open to them that is not about battle and warfare. So in battle and warfare, they're in fact the opposite of, and so many characters are killed. And you mentioned Frodo and Sam, or Frodo being having a kind of PTSD and this wound that won't heal. But there's also people that like Éowyn and Merry, who face the Witch King, and they are marked to the end of their days. And Faramir, who's shattered by his own father. Denethor dies, and I mean
Theoden dies.
There's so many characters that die that it's just. His work being an epic has so many characters. So his heroes seem invincible. I don't think you're reading the books, not the books I'm reading anyway.
No. Agreed. All right. Number 7. Some of the Lord of the Rings main characters lack agency. This sounds... Or
as I like to say, some writers about Lord of the Rings lack intelligence, because his own point, he brings up a single example about characters lacking agency, and it is terrible.
Let's read it. Let's read it. Contemporary readers like their principal. This guy again. Contemporary readers, a euphemism for the modern audiences, like their principal characters who have agency in their story, and characters who don't are often maligned. A good example might be Twilight's Bella Swan. Oh, bringing Twilight in comparison to the Lord of the Rings. This is awesome. Who many readers dislike due to her passive role in the narrative. In The Two Towers, which is really just 1/3, or in fact 1/6 of the Lord of the Rings in this story here. They begin the book, Merry and Pippin are largely passive characters. They begin the book captured by a pack of orcs and stay that way until the Rohirrim kill the orcs and allow Merry and Pippin to escape with little effort. That's not exactly a long section of the book right there either. Later, they become passive observers of the Ents' destruction of Isengard. Even the team behind the Two Towers film adaptation thought that modern audiences would be unhappy with this depiction of the hobbits and updated their story to make them a bit more involved. I think right there, what they're saying is that it's Merry and Pippin who convinced the Ents to march on Isengard. That was a big argument back in the day that they should not have done that. It's the Ents that should have made the decision. But there, it's Merry and Pippin arguing with the Ents in a way that causes them to...
Yeah, in fact... Isengard doesn't fall if Merry and Pippin don't start the avalanche. That's the difference. And need I point out, Merry is responsible for the defeat of one of the 3 greatest foes that exist in the books by stabbing the Witch King in the knee and allowing Éowyn to get the killing blow. So you have an apparently largely passive character and a woman killing the Witch King. This is such a stupid and false point. I don't want to talk about it anymore.
And then in the beginning, in the Fellowship of the Ring, you have the hobbits. These characters that he's saying don't have agency. They're the ones that plot to get Frodo out of the Shire.
No, that's right.
They're the ones that take the initiative to get him out, and it's like saying they didn't do that. Oh, okay.
So because they don't have agency in this one part of the entire story, they don't have agency in the entire part of the story.
Right.
Well, it's also
saying.
Agency is like, your definition of agency is apparently unbelievably simplistic because you have to actually be the one swinging the fist to be an agent. No, they're the ones that brought about the swinging fist that destroyed Isengard. Yeah. So they were the agents.
Yeah. This is again. And go ahead, Dan.
Well, I was going to say, no character in any book ever has agency. They only do what the author tells them to do, right? So this is just right, like
right. Yeah. Otherwise, you're left like if they say no characters have agency. If it was just like Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin sitting in a room talking together while things happen around them, okay, maybe they're sitting at home smoking pipeweed and everything happens around them. That's not having agency. But they're on a freaking quest. They get captured by orcs. Boromir dies because of them. I mean, you would say that. That's not positive agency, but that's them actually influencing the way things happen because of who they are. So I don't know, man. Agency is a word used in graduate literature classes to somehow make yourself sound smart. That's where I'm going to leave this. And
exactly. Let's move on.
Number 6. The story, it takes a while to get started.
Oh my goodness.
Hey guys, did you know that a lot of modern media, books included, are very concerned with hooking audiences as quickly as possible in an oversaturated landscape of fiction? It makes sense that books need to do everything they can to prevent readers from putting them down and moving on to the next one. Makes sense.
Do you know why the modern scene is oversaturated with fiction? Because of the greatness of the work of this man in no small part. It's because he built a world and he took so long to do it, and he made so many elements, put so many elements in, and I would argue the start of the Fellowship of the Ring shows you the Shire, it shows you the goodness the hobbits come from, that they leave to face the danger. Same thing with the Hobbit in the novel Hobbit. Yeah. This is so silly. It's like you don't understand. Yes, you're right. This is a different kind of book than the ones that he later uses an example about from Brandon Sanderson's famous just went blank on the name of the cycle that his fantasy sci-fi novel. What's that?
Mistborn?
Nope, not Mistborn. It's the same universe, but different. It's something of Kings, so the way of Kings. Anyway, so yeah, he has a very exciting start to his. Yeah, great. So what? Brandon Sanderson says that he owes so much of what he does to Tolkien. So now you're saying Tolkien should have been more like Brandon Sanderson? You're an idiot.
Yeah. I love that there's like Dan mentioned at one point earlier on another one of the facts, one of the 10 reasons here. There is no logic or fact in anywhere this here. Is like it's the standard for audiences who are used to fantasy stories. I'm like, what? How much does that actually encompass? Because a lot of fantasy stories, if they've ever read Robert Jordan, you want to talk about some slow parts. There are some incredibly slow parts in Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time. And so
like whole books that are all slow parts.
The Fellowship of the Ring's opening will likely feel quaint and outdated. First of all, the Fellowship of the Ring's opening also has Old Man Willow. It has the Barrow Downs. It has escaping a Nazgul.
It's Tom Bombadil and Gildor and Glorian.
There's a lot of stuff that happens, and they could say like, well, the only thing that I will say is that most people lose it if they're not invested yet in it, or if they've taken too long to read it, or if somebody told them to read it, you're going to love it, and then it doesn't catch them right away. Is they lose it at the Council of Elrond. Yeah, where there's a lot of exposition that goes on there, but all you got to do is make it through that. And that's not even that bad, though. I mean, it's like, what, 15 pages, maybe? Mm-hmm. Maybe?
Yeah.
But this comes from somebody who's used to scrolling through TikTok and wants the next quick adrenaline hit rather than actually taking the time to read something.
Yeah, you've got a 60-second attention span, and you cannot give yourself to anything for any longer period of time. And let yourself develop into it. This is a problem with modern audiences. It's not a problem with Tolkien.
Modern audiences.
Yeah.
It's a problem with just a lot of people. The way people are, it's like they don't have the patience anymore to do anything, let alone read a book. True. How many people do you know who are like in my life? I know very few people who are always reading, like who are always reading a book. There are very few people like that anymore, and it is a sad thing.
Yeah. So from the next one. That's so much for number 6, which is just him not understanding how great books work. But
let's move on to number 5 then. The The Lord of the Rings books lack diversity. What are you talking about there? Dwarves and elves and hobbits and humans.
Yep.
And trolls.
Yeah, it turns out there's more
orcs.
races than you'll find in most movies and books.
Did you guys know? Because Tolkien was largely inspired by white European history and myths, The Lord of the Rings is not a very diverse series of books. The main cast of characters is all presumed to be white based on the books, and even adaptations of the work reflect this lack of diversity. I'm sure they're very upset with the history of Europe being very non-diverse too. We need to not talk about the actual history of medieval Europe and its lack of diversity. But representation in media matters, Michael, Dan, as some studies have just suggested that positive representation can lead to a greater acceptance of people who are othered. Oh man, I hate that word. Having a series of books featuring all white lead characters is a notion that feels dated with today's sensibilities. How much do we need to talk about this? Are we going to be shut down if we even talk about this?
This is a product. This is a product of a failed ideology, or not. It hasn't failed yet, but it is in the process of failing. It's totally bankrupt. This is a ridiculous notion. That's like saying if somebody were to take a book about the Lay of Gilgamesh, that the fact that they included mostly characters with dark skin would be a lack of diversity because they're all dark skinned characters.
Well, this goes to the point. Diversity is not a value. Diversity is a statement of appearance, right? For them, it just means the way something looks. There's no value associated with it. Being diverse doesn't mean anything is better necessarily. If I have a diverse group of criminals, it's just as bad as having a non-diverse group of criminals. It's not a value statement.
Yep. And when they say representation in media matters, what they mean is that having the same number of races in a book that one would find on the streets of New York City is what matters. And I reject that.
And I love in this picture, in this one picture, there are 4 different races represented.
That's right. How could they say that there's only one race?
Say there's only one race. It's so sad.
What's interesting to me about this point, this ideology keeps changing. So when I was growing up, I was a kid of the 90s. Diversity meant skin color, and it meant gender. In terms of 2 genders, it was having more women represented and having more people of color represented. And just like the last 5 years, this has shifted to now being LGBTQ plus inclusive. It's like an ever expanding diversity that must be met. And so if we try to meet that standard today in whatever writing you're doing, who's to say in 20 years they don't invent another 500 genders and now you're outdated again?
The goalposts are always moving, always, or going narrower, I guess. I mean, the diversity to me, and you can shout me down if you want to, it simply means not white male. That's what diversity means. It's more defined by its negative than its positive. So, I don't know. So let's move on. Number 4, some races in The Lord of the Rings are inherently evil. Oh, the problem of evil. In The Lord of the Rings, there are certain races that are only represented by evil characters. The orcs, uruks, and goblins, for instance, only appear in the form of evil antagonists, leading readers to believe that all members of these races are evil. I wish Tolkien had talked more. They had talked more in the movies about the good orcs that Tolkien talked about in the Silmarillion. Tolkien said nothing. See, I'm joking. Tolkien said nothing is evil in the beginning, which is a good sentiment. Oh, they gave him a little bit of a back pat. However, when every character from a race is shown to be evil, it does make readers think that every member of that race must be evil. Even if the race is depicted as fantasy races, the idea that a group of people are, well, okay, is all born with the same immutable qualities is outdated and frankly problematic.
I do like the image of this guy patting Tolkien on the head. Hey,
good job.
You did it. You almost did it.
You're halfway there.
So condescending.
So I mean, I have no problem with evil being evil and good being good. We talked about this in a little bit about this in C.S. Lewis's review of The Two Towers and The Return of the King, where he makes the point that even then, they didn't like the idea of evil being evil and good being good, and they thought it was the dumbing down of things. But this would be kind of like saying, in the sense, like, well, how can you show all demons as evil? I mean, just because they're sitting there in the pit of hell, devouring the souls of, I mean, and okay, I'm being a little bit hyperbolic here, but devouring the souls, like, how can we simply say they're all evil?
Yeah, this is a problem of relativism. This is like, in order for something to be interesting, you have to take black and white and make it gray. And it's completely at odds with reality of what the reality of things are. It's just that there is true good, there is true evil. And you have characters in Lord of the Rings. Tolkien has characters that struggle between those two. You have Boromir, you have Frodo, where they want to be good and they are tempted by what's evil. So you do have that represented. But at the end of the day, it wouldn't make sense unless there is pure good and pure evil.
Yeah, in this take, I have a letter of Tolkien's to bring up. So he talks about extensively in Morgoth's Ring. I had to look it up because I had remembered it, but I forgot what it said. So let me quote from Morgoth's Ring a question. Well, let me actually first pull up two quotes. One from letter 153 of Tolkien's. He's talking about orcs, and he says, they would be Morgoth's greatest sins, abuses of his highest privilege, and would be creatures begotten of sin and naturally bad. And then here's an important point. I nearly wrote irredeemably bad, but that would be going too far, because by accepting or tolerating their making necessary to their actual existence, even orcs would become part of the world, which is God's and ultimately good. But whether they could have souls, and he goes on to talk whether they have souls or spirits in the way that we do or not, or whether they're more like beasts. So he himself was still figuring out, actually, this idea of an evil race. And what he lands on, and I think in Morgoth's Ring, there's more of a hint to it. He says, but even before this wickedness of Morgoth was suspected, the wise in the elder days taught always that orcs were not made by Melkor, and therefore were not in their origin evil. They might have become irredeemable, at least by elves and men, but they remained within the law. That is, though of necessity being the fingers of the hands of Morgoth, they must be fought with the utmost severity. They must not be dealt with in their own terms of cruelty and treachery. Captives must not be tormented, not even to discover information for the defense of the homes of elves and men. If any orcs surrendered and asked for mercy, they must be granted it, even at a cost. So Tolkien's pointing out that because their origins, he's painting a vision of a race of beasts, of creatures that were first made good and then irredeemably, or perhaps not irredeemably, corrupted by Morgoth. So because of the fact that in their original nature they were not evil, that there's a burden upon people, even in war, to deal with them without cruelty, etc. So it's an interesting point. So my comment to this is that they're not inherently evil. Orcs are not inherently evil. They were corrupted and made so by Morgoth. And at the time of the war, they acted with complete evil, and there's nothing but a vice in their every action, even when they're not just fighting, as we see from the Tower of Cirith Ungol and the relations between the orcs there. There's other vices other than malice and murder, but they're not inherently evil. But that's not a subtlety that I expect the writer of this article to be able to understand.
I would say that I like that quote you brought up. It made me think that the orcs are a part of the song, right? Of the song of the Ainur, the song that Iluvatar sang to bring the Arda, the world, Ea, into existence. And so just that alone makes them not inherently evil, I think. However,
yes,
I would say that the idea that, and I think to them, maybe to boil this into how they view it, how this writer views it, is that inherently evil means we're simply not seeing somebody in this race who's good, or who struggles with their conscience, and that alone makes this unacceptable. rather than the state of the orcs. And so the book does itself a disservice by not showing us how orcs, true, they have agency to make a decision about their own being, about their own future, about choosing the good rather than the bad. And by not doing that, Tolkien has done a disservice to modern audiences.
Yep, I think that's right.
All right, let's move on. Number 3, the geography of Middle-earth is concerning. When I read The Lord of the Rings, I thought this geography...
The buzzwords.
It is concerning, perhaps problematic. It is othering.
Actually, I've been concerned by the geography sometimes, but not for the reason this guy is talking about.
Some critics of Tolkien's work have pointed out some potentially concerning connections between where certain groups live in Middle-earth and real-life biases. Geographically, there is largely the East versus West dynamic in the books, which is even directly referenced in the text. In the books, the good characters come from the West, and the bad characters are from the East. Tolkien addressed this criticism, saying it arose simply due to the narrative he was telling, but it does parallel some concerning talking points, the idea of protecting Western civilization. Oh, you mean the ones that brought more freedom and prosperity to the world than anything else in the history of the entire universe? It has been used by some bad actors in support of white nationalism, xenophobia. Oh, right. We're going to make this connection, even though there is no evidence for that connection anywhere at all anywhere.
I'm surprised they didn't say Nazis.
More politically active readers of The Lord of the Rings will likely see some red flags in this similarity. Perhaps they could say more politically active, casual, or not readers of The Lord of the Rings, but watchers of the films and readers of Twitter feeds.
Right. So? Yeah. So the whole basis upon which this man writes his, assuming he's a man, writes this article is the entire substructure that was created by Western civilization is problematic and concerning.
I don't even know where to start, because when you say you're not allowed to use the word West to say good, simply because that's the fantasy world that was constructed. When you say Valinor was in the West, the best was in the West, right? They came from the West. I mean, it wasn't even in Tolkien's mind, I don't think, to say like, Western civilization. Well, since we came in the West, what's the westernmost place we can go to? Well, it's Florida. So everybody came from, so Valinor is Florida. No, the West doesn't mean, and I understand Western civilization, Greek, Europe, Rome, all that sort of stuff moving forward. But to say that we now simply can't say West or East to determine where good and bad comes from, just because some have
in a fantasy world, you can't use a certain point of the compass to make good people there and bad people from another point of the compass.
Of course,
it's just dumb.
Right, and really, the West here means the Noldor that came out of Valinor. Really, I mean, ultimately, because when you think what was even further west than this, well, Thangorodrim, where Morgoth dwelt, was further west than what we see here in this map, because it was destroyed at the end of the First Age. And so, maybe that sates them a little bit.
The whole West versus East thing is interesting. Because in the First Age, you see men coming out of the East that are good. So you have the Edain that come out of the East. I don't know.
Yeah.
I kind of see I see the connection that he's making, like Western civilization,
me too.
West. I don't know if that's like you were kind of pointing to. I don't know if Western civilization is bad. So like even if that connection is there, is that bad?
Right. Well, they simply say because Western civilization is a euphemism for nationalism and xenophobia. That's the connection they're trying to make, and because
white nationalism, it's racism.
So people in the East don't have nations and they don't hate other races. I'm sure.
No. If you were to move,
clearly he's never been to
Dan,
Asia.
you would be completely 100% accepted as a Japanese. No,
right.
you wouldn't.
Yeah, I'm
that
sure.
never happens. Anyway, it's much ado about nothing, because they have to find something, and so political activism will simply use East and West somehow in The Lord of the Rings to make it less in their own minds, because it has to be, because it was written by a white cis-hetero male. Sorry, cis-heteronormative male. All right, that's it for
that's all we have to say about that.
Let's move on. Number 3, let's move on. Number 2, Tolkien's work features uncomfortable racial terminology.
And then, wait for it, he proceeds, I thought he was going to go somewhere else, but he proceeds to quote terminology which is distinctively not racial. So his point is it has uncomfortable racial terminology, and then he gives a quote, and the quote is from Barlam and Butterbur, "No black man shall pass my doors while I stand on my legs." And Barlam and Butterbur is talking about a wraith, a ring wraith.
A Nazgul.
The Nazgul direct, it's talking about black cloaks worn by the Nazgul. There is no uncomfortable racial terminology because there is no racial terminology at all. It's not race, you idiot.
I don't know what he means, and also refers to the Nazgul using a slur.
I don't know. Like I even thought to look it up, and then I realized I wasn't going to give this man another moment of my time by looking up anything.
How much of a ween is the person that wrote this? Their points are: this is concerning, this is problematic, this makes me uncomfortable. It's like, who cares? Like just get over it. Like that's my immediate reaction to this.
Dan, it's detracting from the intended message of love and cooperation.
Okay, so this is my favorite sentence of the entire article, because all of a sudden this person that is so uncomfortable and so concerned and finds everything in Tolkien so problematic, now suddenly they know what the intended message of Tolkien was. They have it. It's theirs. They're to bestow upon us. And what do? It's the intended message of love and cooperation. How about this, dude? How about you read the books to find out what the intended message is, not inject your hippie crap on your review of this. That isn't the intended message. It isn't love and cooperation. Yes, there is love. Yes, there is cooperation. That's not the...
Sam and Frodo and Gollum cooperate together to destroy the ring.
I got your love right here. Yeah. So this is what it produces in me. It produces the urge to violence.
I would love to see a person like this try to read the Silmarillion and see what's the intended message of the Silmarillion. Everybody dies, and there's no hope.
It's love and cooperation. Clearly.
Oh my God!
Yeah, they always latch onto these themes that for Tolkien are probably present. They're probably somewhere in his reason for writing. He's concerned about beauty. He's concerned about truth. He's concerned about honor and keeping your word and keeping your promise, and so there's all these high themes of heroism and the epic,
integrity and heroism and hope,
and how that plays out in the virtues of a life. But they always just cherry pick. Like, I'll take that one, and I'll take this one, and then I'm going to bring in my ideology over here, and okay, this is what Tolkien's supposed to be. Like,
I don't even think cooperation is not a message of the Lord of the Rings. Like you said, it's heroism, it's integrity, and the choices that you make can look like cooperation when heroism and integrity are involved, but it's not like, you know what, because you're an elf and I'm a dwarf and we've got hobbits and humans, let's cooperate. That was not the message of the Lord of the Rings at all. In fact, there was more...
You know who did a lot of cooperation in Lord of the Rings? The Nazgul. They cooperated perfectly.
They were a great team.
They never fought amongst themselves.
And they were black, so it was okay.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's my main problem. I think you're entirely right, Jonathan. I think your points are excellent, Dan, about what they're doing, and they construct this stupidity of a critique. But we can't get away from the fact that the only evidence they try to make a point, and they bring a piece of evidence, and the only evidence they bring for their point that that Tolkien has uncomfortably racist racial terminology is an example where it's not racial terminology.
I know. Yeah, right. It's descriptive.
They're describing the color of a cloak. Right. It's the man is black because he's completely covered in, or the Nazgul is black because he's completely covered in a black cloak. It's not a black man. Well, but see, there's no uncomfortable racial terminology.
Here's the problem. Tolkien had already read Ibram X. Kendi. He was an anti-racist.
Oh my
already.
Gosh.
So because of that, Tolkien knew that just using the word black was a dog whistle, right? So
I missed that Tolkien himself professed to be an anti-racist before the term existed. That changes everything.
I hope you've learned, guys, that anti-racism is an inherent message of the Lord of the Rings, along with love and cooperation. That's what
this article takes on a new meaning for the term doom scrolling. I feel more and more doomed.
You are doomed to the next one. Well, we are doomed to move on to the last one. Number 1, Tolkien's world features very few women. The Lord of the Rings is largely a story about male characters, but female characters in Tolkien's work are largely sidelined or defined by their relationships to men in the story by today's standard. Hey guys, today's standards. This type of story, you're not allowed to tell stories about men. This type of storytelling doesn't really hold up. Similar to ensuring there is good representation across races, dwarves, elves, Maiar, humans, it is also important for media to portray characters of multiple genders, so I can be 3 genders at the same time.
Yes.
I don't think that's what I mean. Though Tolkien does include some good
I don't know, the Barrow-wights were probably a different gender.
Notably Eowyn Swilling, the Witch King, they do not feel like fully realized people.
I think this may have been an attempt to just see how many buzzwords they could put in. I just like fully realized
the whole thing. They took Grammarly's new dictionary rules and said, how can we apply this to this article?
Yeah.
And said, let's throw all these words in here.
So what do we have to say about this?
So one thing that jumps out to me reading the Silmarillion with you guys and reading the Lord of the Rings is there are prominent moments, and even this article admits there are prominent moments when there are women who kind of break out of a stereotypical role for women, and they are valiant warriors in battle, or through the sheer strength of their will, they lead their people, like the people of
Haleth.
The people of Haleth. They renamed their whole people because they all follow this one woman because she leads them by the sheer strength of her will. So you have those breakout things, but I think also at the bottom of this is just a rejection of any differences between men and women at all. It's like if you have any kind of stereotypical roles for men and women, and then show women in those roles not only excelling or thriving or exhibiting positive traits in those roles, it's almost like they just reject that. Like, that's not valid.
They've defined, by doing this, what they do is they've defined that the only positive traits are the masculine traits that they've identified in the male characters. There's no positivity to women when it comes being feminine, being a mother, which only a woman with a womb can do, right? None of that is valuable here. Or being a healer, which by all accounts is, like in my marriage, is certainly more the woman's role than mine. I'm the suck it up and let it bleed kind of dad. Whereas my wife is get the Band-Aid, get the bandage. Let's cuddle. Let's get together and make sure they feel good, and then send them off again. So yeah. Anyway, but they fixed it, right? They fixed it in the Rings of Power because we got a real woman leading that show in Galadriel. Well, that is the woman that they wanted, though, isn't it? Though, like the Galadriel is the woman that they wanted,
and she ended up being a really hated woman, and that's the thing. Like when they try to make women that all they are is defined by their attempt to act like men, that's what you end up with. It is fascinating to me that the people are they pick and choose. So let's say 2 things. One, yes, most of the characters in Lord of the Rings are male versus female. It is in fact an epic war story. And in epic war stories across history, men play a prominent role. So yes, we have most of the prominent roles being played by men in this story. That makes it an epic war story. So that's point 1. Point 2, we always ignore all the great things that the women do. So I would call people who have read the Silmarillion's attention to the fact that that Sauron is second fiddle to the great big bad in Middle-earth, Morgoth. And there are only 2 beings in the history of Middle-earth that have conquered Morgoth. Tolkis, the Valar of War, and Luthien Tinuviel, a woman. So that's it. Those are the only 2. And so one of them is a woman. If you read the appendices to the Return of the King, you'll find out that the entire fortress, Sauron's secondary fortress of Dol Guldur, was destroyed single-handedly by Galadriel, by herself, not her army. So she somehow has the power to take down an entire fortress by herself. They're Éowyn, the only Nazgul ever defeated in combat in Tolkien's work, done by a woman. So it's just silly. They're trying to make political points. Anyway, I'm done.
As it is, as C.S. Lewis's review of The Two Towers and The Return of the King, which I will link below if I can find it for you guys. He says that, we dip our reality in story and fantasy, and it becomes more real, and it becomes more alive to us than anything else. And what these people have done, what these kinds of people do, is they want to take fantasy and dip it in our reality, and it becomes less good and less fantastic and less real. And I think through this kind of an article, that's what we see.
Yeah, I don't want what this guy's peddling. I don't want what he thinks most modern audiences want. If that's what they do want, it ain't for me. It ain't for, and it isn't what made Tolkien great.
I think he lives in a bubble, and the modern audience is himself and two of his friends that went to grad school.
You're probably right.
Yeah, that still watch Mean Girls every once in a while.
So, well, I think it's proven in the fact that he's still writing about Tolkien all these years later. He's not writing about something else that they've created. They have to try to take this down.
If Tolkien had done everything that he had, if it had all these biracial, multi-gender, 50+% women, all of like East versus West, South versus East was something different than the West. If he'd done all that and written all that, it wouldn't be around today. No one would care.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, we can. Just remember, if you want to see all the great ways that these 10 things have been implemented in a fantasy story that I won't call a Tolkien story, but a fantasy story, go watch The Rings of Powers and you can see how that turned out for him. Both of you who liked it, you can contact me and
well said.
Tweet me at Torque on Twitter.
Well said. Well said.
All right, guys, thanks for following through all this with us. I just felt like this would be kind of fun to see like how bad it really, really is, and to know the dangers that are out there in a way. Right, there are a lot of people who really believe this. Like they really believe that Tolkien was racist because he called a Nazgul black. Like they really believe this. This is, to them, this is the great sin. And we have to fight back against this kind of crap and call it out when we see it, because if we don't, then it's just going to keep growing and growing. And that's what's happened in schools. That's what happened 20 years ago when I got a degree in literature. And I'm sure it's only getting worse, because using words like othering and agency and modern audiences, right? Those are the things that fly around in those circles today. And it's complete worthless crap. Like it doesn't hold it. They have to talk about Tolkien rather than talking about anything good that's new, because there's nothing good that's new coming out of these circles anymore. That's my final take on it, guys. Very cathartic. Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah. All right. Nope. Go ahead, Dan. You close us out.
I was going to say, just in my summing up of what I'm thinking is that good stories are rooted in reality and truth. And what this article is just this person's subjective feeling. It's not reality or truth. Yes. And so it's not good storytelling. No. If you try to meet every one of these criteria to satisfy modern audiences, like Michael was saying, we would not be reading Tolkien today if he wrote it for this purpose.
Exactly.
Agreed. Yeah. Everybody go read The Lord of the Rings and don't watch The Rings of Power. That's my final take. See y'all.
All right.
Bye.